Thank you all very much for coming along tonight. It's actually quite a reasonable night. It's not that cold. I presented last year's. No, it's all right. I presented last year's and I had about 4 layers on and I was still shivering at the end of it. So I think it's a little bit warmer and we do have the fire. So thank you all again for coming along tonight. I want to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose land we're meeting here tonight. A peoples as well that I have deep family connections with and family members who are both Ngunnawal and Ngambri. And of course I spent part of my childhood here living in Canberra, so it really does feel like home to me. This is the second Yindyamarra Oration. I had the pleasure of delivering the inaugural oration last year. And we had the idea of being able to bring you in to a shared space, to do something a little bit different to normal university orations, not to put you in a university hall and have people on a stage, but to put you here under these beautiful trees in the shadow of the cross and around this fire. Because what we seek to do here is to bring people into a shared space of peace and respect and love. To bring you into a place where we can meet one another and be able to share deep truths about the human condition. Yindyamarra, for those of you who are not familiar, is a Wiradjuri term from my people, which speaks to many things really, but I think my father summed it up best when he said, it tells you where you are and not who you are. It invites people into a relationship that is grounded in place. It isn't about race, it isn't about history. It is about our responsibility to one another, to share space, to open space. Yindyamarra is about respect, it is about reciprocity, and it is about creating a love between people that honours the place that we call home. The Yindyamarra Oration is inspired by the words of the French philosopher and mystic Simone Weil, who said in her famous essay, Human Personality, that what human beings require is silence and warmth, but what we too often receive is an icy pandemonium. I don't think anything more speaks to our age than the idea of an icy pandemonium, a chill wind that tears at our souls, the harsh, brittle noise of our politics that divides us. What the Yindyamarra Oration seeks to do is to locate us in that silence and in that warmth, to rescue us from the icy pandemonium. And who better to deliver the second oration than a very dear friend of mine, Scott Stephens. He's not here just because he's a friend of mine. He's here because he is one of the great thinkers of our country, of our world and our time. Scott is a person of endless compassion, of dignity, a moral philosopher, a theologian, a writer, a broadcaster. He is, with Waleed Aly, the host of the Minefield on ABC Radio National. He's also the editor of the ABC's Religion and Ethics page. He is someone who grapples with the big questions of our time and in the true tradition of Yindyamarra seeks to open ourselves to one another so that the stranger is no longer a stranger. There are many things I could say about Scott, but I think it's better that we hear from him. So please welcome to deliver the second Yindyamarra Oration, Scott Stephens. Thank you, Scott.
That's the first time I've heard gloved applause, can I say? There are many things about this evening that are new for me. Thank you so much, Stan. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the warm welcome to these lands. I would, of course, like to thank as well Peter Sherlock and the members of the Yindyamarra Trust for this invitation to be here with you this evening. But I do want to offer a particular thanks to Stan himself, and maybe if you'll let me, I'd like to do this on behalf of those of us here. Over the last 2 years, in particular, Stan Grant has given himself with a tender and at times fierce devotion to the loving care of words and to the patient articulation of the beautiful, the good, and the honorable within our common life. Like few others that I can think of in this country or in the world, he has cultivated a truthfulness in an age of inane chatter. He's inhabited silence in a world of incessant noise. He's borne witness to the beauty of decency in decidedly indecent times. Stan is a rare soul, someone who has managed to maintain his decency, his dignity through it all. And for his witness and for his friendship, I'm very, very grateful. So thank you, Stan. Just trying to feel my fingers here. Well, because of our shared love for music, to the point that that love surpasses aesthetic delight and approaches something more like a need for the soul, I wanted to begin this oration, which is a genuine delight and pleasure to deliver. I wanted to begin it on a somewhat unusual note, but I hope it's not an unfitting one. I'll confess that I wasn't expecting to start this way, but the more I turned the topic over in my mind, it seemed like there was no other. For the decades following the Second World War, there were European philosophers and intellectuals who couldn't quite bring themselves to make peace with German culture, with its art, its philosophy, its music, because of that culture's failure to restrain the nation from succumbing to the demonic charm of National Socialism. These intellectuals feared that behind this failure was not so much impotence or effeteness, but rather a deeper complicity, a tacit accommodation to Hitler's supremacist and genocidal drive, which is to say they feared that certain aspects of the prevailing culture had provided the intellectual and aesthetic conditions within which the monstrousness of the final solution could take place. Some of the emblematic figures of this complicity are clear enough. There'll be names known to you all. There is the 19th century composer Richard Wagner, with his passionate anti-Semitism and brazen declarations of the innate repugnance that all civilized persons feel in the presence of Jewish people. There's the philosopher Martin Heidegger, who in his black notebooks from 1934 identified the assimilated Jew as the true enemy and insisted on the difficult necessity of the commitment to, quote, ferret out the enemy, force him to reveal himself, remain ready to attack, and to initiate the attack on a long-term basis with the goal of total extermination. There's Josef Mengele, the Schutzstaffel physician and torturer of Birkenau, known to his unfortunate patients as the Angel of Death. Mengele, who would whistle arias while selecting prisoners to be sent to gas chambers, and who was fond of unwinding in the evenings after a hard day's work by listening to Franz Schubert and Robert Schumann. Then there are the SS officers and guards, more generally, who demanded that music be played in the camps. Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Brahms. As Shirley Gilbert writes, music provided a framework within which the SS could maintain their self-image of refined German culture and personal decency, not apart from, but precisely in the context of the quote-unquote activities that they performed during the day. There's something profoundly fitting, then, I think, that Thomas Mann's allegorical epic, Dr. Faustus, written in the early 1940s while Mann himself was living in exile in the Pacific Palisades in California, that Thomas Mann would tell the story of the spiritual corruption of his fatherland, of its pact with the devil through the character of the renowned composer Adrian Leverkühn, who made public the source of his infernal genius and subsequently dies not long after, in the novel this is, Germany invades Poland. In those days, Mann writes in the final page of the book, Germany, a hectic flush on its cheeks, was reeling at the height of its savage triumphs, about to win the world on the strength of the one pact it intended to keep and had signed with its own blood. But by the time of the narratives present, some years after the end of the war, the nation, Mann writes, lies in the embrace of demons, a hand over one eye, the other staring into horror. May God have mercy on your poor soul, my friend, my fatherland. But of course, Mann's critique of Germany and of German culture was an intimate one. It was a loving critique. It was heartbroken and homesick. The story of Adrian Leverkühn is, after all, told, as the subtitle of the novel tells us, by a friend. A critique of an altogether different kind, marked by a pained yet resolute unforgiveness, would come from the French moral philosopher and musicologist Vladimir Jankélévitch. Jankélévitch's critique took the form of total renunciation. After the war, he would scrub his writings on music and philosophy clean of references to or reliance upon the German intellectual and aesthetic tradition. He wrote several books on music. You can imagine what those books look like without references to Beethoven, to Bach, to Mozart, to Schumann. Jankélévitch found that he could simply no longer trust that tradition because he believed that he saw at its heart an absolutizing impulse, a relentlessness, a long-windedness, an overwhelmingness, an explicitness, a tactlessness, what might be called a too-muchness. All these things together disposed that culture towards, Jankélévitch said, the inhuman. For Jankélévitch, the tactlessness, the thoroughgoingness, the too-muchness, what he would ultimately call the decadence of that culture is nowhere better expressed than in Heidegger's verbal incontinence and in Wagner's operatic excess. The danger of such decadence was its capacity to overrun, to overwhelm what is of greatest value, and therefore what is most fragile to human life. That which demands from us hesitation, attentiveness, and utmost care. And yet, for someone like Jankélévitch, the act of renunciation of that culture was not enough. It had to be accompanied by a corresponding recovery of imagination, an attunement to the moral reality of the beautiful, a disposition, a cultivated disposition of tenderness and delicacy, almost passivity in the presence of that which is truly precious. This disposition doesn't set about to make or to remake the world. It neither purges nor takes back control, greatness, supremacy, whatever else. It neither asserts nor does it justify. It is rather an alertness to what is. It's a pledge to be responsive to that which is at the moment and in the form of its appearing. One of the things that strikes me powerfully in Jankélévitch's book on music and the ineffable, and I'll admit that when I recently reread it, I thought powerfully of Stan. When Jankélévitch describes musical encounter, he describes it in terms that are highly reminiscent to the way that someone like Simone Weil or Iris Murdoch refers to moral encounter. For instance, he says, encountering a pure piece of music is like an iridescent soap bubble that quivers and glows for a few seconds in the sunlight until it collapses the moment you touch it. Music, he says, is the silence of all other noises. because as soon as music raises its voice, it demands solitude. Music, he writes, imposes silence on words and their soft purring, that is, upon the facile and voluble noise of all, the noise of idle chatter. Notice in this music, unlike Wagner's volume, in this music there is no overwhelming presence, either of person or of music. There is rather an encounter, a fleeting suggestion, an invitation to wonder. I find that Jean Kelevich here picks up a line of thought that was articulated fully a generation earlier, closer to the First World War than the Second. That was articulated by the novelist André Gide in a remarkable series of notes and commentaries that he wrote on the music of Friedrich Chopin. What captivates Gide time and time again is Chopin's diminutive presence, his hesitancy and restraint, in contrast to the enormousness of Wagner. Not just the inhuman length of each opera, but in the excesses of all kinds, in his insistence, the number of instruments, the overworking of the voices, the pathos. The sole concern for Chopin, meanwhile, is evidently to narrow the limits. He says that while Wagner charged all of his emotion with notes, the responsibility of Chopin was to charge each note with emotion. Wagner's music, for Gide, behaves like the forces of fate and history with a capital F and a capital H. It demands submission, obedience, whereas Chopin proposes, supposes, insinuates, seduces, persuades. It never asserts. And whereas punishment or ostracism awaits for those who refuse Wagner's decadence, what consequence, what loss is in store for those who fail to take up Chopin's gentle invitation? Nothing but the vanishing possibility of aesthetic encounter itself, the opportunity to find oneself speechless. At one point, Gide says that at the top of each page of Chopin's sheet music should be written a couplet by Paul Valéry. Is not this slowness the tenderest art? My question is this. If we have already witnessed in the first half of the 20th century and are witnessing now in our time what heedlessness, too muchness, brazenness, decadence does to the conditions of political life, do we yet know what form this slowness, this tenderness, this almost imperceptible attendance to the fleetingly beautiful, do we know what this would look like in the lives that we now live? I believe we do. And I believe the word for that is decency. Now, I realize that in talking about decency at a time like this and in a time like this is to invite the charge of resignation to irrelevance. After all, whatever the term decency evokes, surely it's something closer to the realm of mores and manners than it is to morals, much less the rough world of politics. In a time like ours, making the case for decency is surely a form of special pleading, an enfeebled and futile attempt to cling to norms or conventions at a moment when such constraints on human behavior have long since lost their purchase. Now, I certainly wouldn't want to deny, it would be silly to do so, the connection between decency and manners. Ever since the 16th century, the word decency has borne with it the sense of propriety, of conformity to the dictates and expectations of the prevailing culture. Decency also historically has a class dimension to it, such that there are things that decent people simply do not do, or behavior that decency quite simply precludes. This dimension, let's call it decorum, it doesn't really exist as much these days. If it does exist, it probably lingers in the confected southern drawl of Victoria Ratliff in season 3 of White Lotus. They're just not decent people. The notion of decency and indecent behavior, more often than not in our time, really attaches more to the criminal code, describing various forms of sexual impropriety, assault, and harm. All of which is to say that what is probably most notable about the idea of decency is that it seems to only ever be skin deep. It's a matter of appearance, right? Of conformity to social expectations, but it neither achieves depth nor does it aspire to goodness. Hence the charge that public displays of decency often cover up and cover over private displays of vice of all kinds. You see this particular drama play itself out in Jane Austen, George Eliot, E.M. Forster. Anna Funder recently pointed it out in her wonderful book on George Orwell's wife. Decency often functions as a kind of prop for egotism, expression of vanity. Think also then of those SS guards who wanted music to be played in the camps as a reminder of their own decency as cultivated, civilized Germans. But it's at this point, I think, that we reach what we might want to call the decency paradox. Yes, decency is a matter of appearance. But the form of its appearance is to prevent the person who is behaving decently from standing out. To be decent is to remain socially inconspicuous, nondescript, invisible. You could say that the goal of decency as decorum is to avoid the stigma or the shame that attaches to the deviant or otherwise conspicuous behavior. We're talking, in other words, about modesty. Think of what the term immodesty, something that becomes showy, shameful, stigmatizing. So keep this decency paradox stored away in your mind. I want to return to it a little bit later. But in the first half of the 20th century, decency in its common usage undergoes a strange sort of transformation. Threefold transformation, in fact. Not exactly out of nowhere. There are precursors in the previous centuries. But it's nonetheless worthwhile pointing out what happened. Firstly, under the strain of the suspicion of hypocrisy that had long bedeviled it, and fueled by the egalitarian, even the bohemian energies that were already apparent on the continent, in the UK, Australia, the United States, decency's claim as a marker of class and therefore of superiority began to buckle under its own weight. The best example I can think of is E.M. Forster's novel Howard's End from 1910. Just think about Henry Wilcox, terrible hypocrite who is himself highly indecent in his own life and yet refuses his wife, Margaret Schlegel's sister, Helen, hospitality in their family home, in their family estate, because she has an illegitimate child. Towards the end of that novel, Henry Wilcox himself ends up convalescent. He ends up largely debilitated due to his own unsuitability to Howard's End, which stands for virtue and protection throughout the book. So here you have Margaret Schlegel, a kind of bohemian German, lovely, aesthetically refined figure. You have her sister Helen and Helen's illegitimate child enjoying the hospitality of Howard's End, while the hypocritical Wilcox is forced to listen from his own seclusion. That's the first transformation that takes place. The second is the way that the concept of decency, especially when it's described as common decency, is shorn of its upper-class imputations. It begins instead to attach to decent folk of the middle and lower classes, over and against the indecency and the excesses of the wealthy, the aristocracy. Although, at the same time, indecency in many circles retained its associations of promiscuity and barbarousness, but now it detaches from class and attaches instead to race and to sexuality. In other words, indecency comes to be associated with aberrance, with deviance. But it is curious nonetheless that indecency here becomes something like ostentatiousness. It accrues, whereas decency accrues the suggestions of honesty, of hard work, modesty, cleanliness, restraint, adherence to the unwritten laws of the social bond. And even for figures like John Dewey and E.B. White, decency simply was the expression of everyday democracy. It was the democratic habit par excellence. For George Orwell, common decency was the moral substance of the British people, its bedrock, a form of patriotic virtue. But there's a third transformation that takes place, most notably after the Second World War. And it's the one that I'm going to devote the next little bit to. It's a transformation that I think is best associated, best articulated with another French thinker, very much like Vladimir Jankelevich, who, in the aftermath of the moral devastation of the Second World War, utterly renounced the Germanic philosophy of history, its heedlessness, its absolute rationality, its language of history and of fate, its providential advance towards some definitive goal, the priority it grants to politics, its acceptance that political goals can be predicated on the necessity of killing and the degradation of human beings. In other words, the logic of history that says that when the desired end has at last been reached, the body count will have been worth it. The figure who rejected this, I'm of course referring to Albert Camus. In the years following the Second World War, Camus grew increasingly concerned that the relentless logic of occupation and resistance had awoken something in French life and culture, something dormant, a malaise, a pathogen, whose effects would outlast the war and now presented a crisis to the human community, to say nothing of the possibility of common value. During a public lecture hosted by Columbia University in New York on the 28th of May, 1946, Camus offered his audience a series of vignettes from during the war. These were all things he knew firsthand. Series of vignettes from during the war to help his American audience grasp a sense of the nature of the malaise. Camus told of a concierge who dutifully mopped up the mess around two suspects who had been tortured overnight by the Gestapo in one of the hotel rooms at her hotel, but offered them no aid. I never interfere with what my tenants do. He told of a German officer who asks an elderly mother to choose which of her 3 sons he should spare. He told of a torturer who matter-of-factly inquires of his victims, whose mutilated ears were still bloodied and bandaged. How are your ears then? And in each instance, Camus says, the words that are spoken are not addressed to a fellow human being, someone to whom tenderness or decency should be shown, someone whose presence might rightly arrest our attention or pause the performance of one's duties, someone to whom consideration should be shown. Rather, these words were addressed to an object, a thing. What could have interposed itself between these people, Camus asks, such that the humanity of one was rendered impervious to the other? In quite a brilliant move, one that I think bears the test of time, Camus assigned the blame to what he called the worship of efficiency and abstraction. Notice the religious term. By the former, efficiency, he means to evoke the dominion of bureaucracy and automation, the hold that these forces have over people's lives, the power which resides in their opacity, the size and sheer heedlessness of their functioning, their inevitability, we might say. These forces are unresponsive to the vulnerability, to say nothing of the preciousness of human life. But the ends they serve are extraneous and ultimately inimical to human well-being. They seem to obey some other law before which human beings must shrink or else be crushed. When it comes to abstraction, however, Camus has something a bit different in mind. He associates abstraction with devotion to an ideology, a philosophy, a theory, a religion, one which replaces individual passions such as pity or empathy or kindness, remorse, love, with collective passions. He also would call them abstract passions, such as fanaticism, zeal, partisan loyalty, chauvinist nationalism, certain forms of obligation or duty. By replacing individual passions with collective passions, the effect of this is to turn real human beings into mere avatars, rendering them fundamentally unreal to one another, reducing them to the status of either combatants in a zero-sum struggle or fodder to be sacrificed on the altar of history. For Camus, one of the enduring consequences of the war and its all-consuming politics was the way that it transformed a certain conception of or faith in the medium of language, its capacity for warmth, its ability to appeal to warm up the humanity of another person. In a powerful set of reflections, Camus acknowledges that in his generation, something in us succumbed to our recent experience of occupation and resistance. That something was humanity's eternal confidence, which always fostered the belief that we could elicit human reactions from human beings by speaking to them in the language of humanity. He says something succumbed in us. The faith that we could elicit human reactions from human beings by speaking to them in the language of humanity. We have witnessed lying, humiliation, killing, deportation, torture, and in each instance it was impossible to persuade the people who were doing these things not to do them because they were sure of themselves and because there is no way of persuading an abstraction. And then the worst words of all. With this, Camus writes, the long dialogue among human beings has now come to an end. The following year, Camus would publish a novel about the outbreak of a mysterious contagion in the Algerian coastal city of Oran, a novel in which he would refer to this plague as the abstraction. He would describe its effect on the inhabitants of this town as obscuring the humanity of those infected by it and isolating them from one another. The characters at the heart of this novel, each in their own way, try to preserve a sense of humanity, lest that humanity be lost in the effort of combating the plague. The character of Grande, for instance, strives for a truer, clearer language, not the language of generality and bureaucratic obscurantism. He wants this language so that he can present the statistics that are needed to direct the efforts of public health workers. The character of Tarou would keep a daily chronicle of the insignificant moments of the life of Oran, lest they be forgotten in the emergency situation. But it is Dr. Rieux's reflections that perhaps are most arresting and ventriloquize Camus' own voice. Dr. Rieux says, the whole thing, the whole thing is not about heroism. It's about decency. This may seem like a ridiculous idea, but the only way to fight the plague is with decency. It is decency which Rieux says consists simply in doing my job. It's decency that allows him to look past the isolations and divisions and antagonisms imposed by the plague and see his patients as simply worthy of care. Decency, after all, is not about the person who exhibits it, but about the worth, the moral reality of the person to whom it is shown. Decency is the refusal of every abstraction that would erect a barrier between us, forbidding sympathy for and conversation with another. Decency belongs to the register of the language of humanity, not to ideology, perhaps not even to politics. Indeed, when Camus writes the language of humanity, he means that which needn't be justified or argued for or insisted upon. He means that which simply is, that to which human beings may simply and rightly and expectantly appeal with the expectation of recognition. When Camus writes of the language of decency, when he evokes the word decency, what he has in mind is something very, very close to what Simone Weil identifies as the guiding moral principle: to know that this person is hungry and thirsty, that this person really exists as much as I do. That is enough. The rest follows of itself. Decency, you notice, is not heroism or saintly love. It takes the form of no act of supererogation or of magnanimity. It is almost nothing. Presque rien. Almost nothing, as Jean Kalevich would put it. It is modest in its ambition. It simply says that there is a line which must not be crossed, that there is no political action, no efficient bureaucracy, no form of words is justifiable that falls beneath that line or outside of its bounds. To give you an idea, Camus tried to propose a truce, the terms of a pact between the warring parties of the terrible bloody struggle in Algeria. And in 1956, he proposed as a modest proposal to garner this truth that both sides simply refuse to slaughter the innocent. Curiously enough, both Camus and someone like Avishai Margalit call that line beneath which politics must not fall simply the refusal to humiliate, simply the refusal to degrade another for extraneous political ends. Decency is what Camus expresses when he writes in the margins of an editorial on the 19th of November 1946. For my part, I have learned over the past 2 years in particular, there is no truth I would place above the life of a human being. Decency is what Camus' contemporary, Wassily Grossman, would call private kindness. Not ostentatious, not showy. The private kindness of one individual towards another. A petty, thoughtless kindness, an unwitnessed kindness, something we might call senseless kindness, a kindness outside any system of social or religious good. Grossman will go on to call this kindness that which is truly human in a human, the highest achievement of the soul, that which protests life is not evil. If saintly love is a portrait, a painting, an icon, we might think of decency so tender and gently warming that it almost doesn't exist. We might think of decency as a window onto that and those who come to be seen as worthy of love in its light. The beauty of decency resides, in other words, in what it permits us to see, not in the act of decency itself. Decency is like the poet in Whitman's Leaves of Grass, the poet who says, indifferently and alike, "How are you, friend?" to the president on his levee, and says, "Good day, my brother," to the slave Cudge as he hoes in the sugar field. And both understand him and know that his speech is right. It's a moment from Leaves of Grass that I love, because there's nothing remarkable in the words that the poet speaks. They can be spoken by anybody. The even-handed equanimity, the warmth of the greeting to president and slave alike makes the poet imperceptible, invisible. The role of the poet is to address both as equals and then to recede from view so that both can then be seen as one another's equals. You leave the moment, this lovely salutation, not wondering at the poet, but struck by the equal dignity of the two. Language in our time is caught, it seems to me, between the imbrooding and coarsening logic of politics and the crude utility of chatbots. Put otherwise, language is caught between abstraction and automation. Language production now increasingly consists as a series of belches and automated spasms produced from the words written and spoken in the past that have been fed into the maw of large language models and regurgitated for the decadency and utility of the present. The heedlessness of politics, the inevitabilism of AI would seem to have us hemmed in. Perhaps, in our time, the only way to fight this plague is with decency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. That has absolutely been in the spirit of Yindyamarra, a spirit that says we must listen before we speak. Scott Stevens called us to decency, and he quoted from Albert Camus, who famously said that I would sooner serve not those who make history, but those who suffer it. It's in the tradition of Simone Weil, who called us to be attentive to those who suffer, who called us to our affliction. The afflicted, she said, who know the truth that when we are hurt, we cry out, "Why are you hurting me?" The question to which there is no answer. Scott spoke to us tonight to caution us to turn away from the noise of the history makers, to turn away from the kinetic force of events and look to the common bonds of humanity. He paid particular attention to words that have lost their beauty and their truth, that are merely words of utility, and words that reduce or diminish the human. I was chilled, as I'm sure so many of you were, when he referred to Camus, who lamented that the long dialogue among human beings has come to an end. It chills me even more when I stop to think that that was 2 generations or more ago that he said that. And consider today when words have been reduced to slogans, when we do not speak to each other, but we shout and we stop listening, and we find it so easy to hurt each other with our words. Scott called us to be attentive to the language that we use, to be attentive to the true meaning of the words of the soul, and the words that reject the too muchness that lead us to so much cruelty, and our capacity in our words to be able to live with that cruelty. How are your wounds today? When I think about Scott and what Scott spoke about tonight, I think of the German poet Paul Celan, who lost both of his parents in the gas chambers of Auschwitz.
who left Germany never to return again and wrote his poetry from France, but said that he would continue to write in the language of those who had slaughtered his people, because he wanted to redeem those words from the horror of the Shoah. We need people like that. We need people who are attentive to words, who see language as a way of reaching somebody, not as a way of rejecting them. The long dialogue among humans is not at an end, and Scott tonight has reminded us of that. But he's reminded us of the challenge of being able to find new words, and I dare say softer words, quieter words. When I listened to what Scott spoke to tonight, it put me in mind of Tracy K. Smith, the former poet laureate of the United States. And she wrote a poem that she called The Nobodies. She thought of those people, the afflicted, those who don't make history but suffer history. She thought about the simple people, the people who don't live big lives but find their lives in the words of the everyday. In her poem, The Nobodies, she wrote, "They rise from the dawn and dress. They raise the bundles to their heads, and their shadows broaden, dark ghosts grounded to nothing. They grin and grip their skirts. They finger the gold and purple beads circling their necks, lift them absently to their teeth. They speak a language of kicked stones. And it's not the future their eyes see, but history. It stretches like a dry road uphill before them. They climb it. Every day we climb that dusty road of history. Every day we shackle that load to our backs. Every day we speak a language of kicked stones. But every day we have the possibility of rising to find a language that can meet the other as we climb that hill together. Scott, you have invited us to climb that hill of history. You've invited us to think about the language that we use. You've invited us to find the words of decency that reject the too muchness of the world, and to find that music in our souls that does not demand to be heard. Thank you so much, Scott, for everything that you delivered tonight. It was truly something worthy of this place and this oration. Please thank Scott again. I want to thank all of you for coming along tonight. I know it's cold, but I hope you're warmed by what you heard. I want to thank our Vice-Chancellor, Renee Leon, for her ongoing support of what we are trying to do here at Yindyamarra Another Way, in being able to bring people into a shared space of silence and warmth to contemplate the decency that is required to find each other in each other. I want to thank Peter Sherlock, Deputy Director of Yindyamarra Another Way, for his work in putting this night together, Nilima Matai for her incredible work to supporting all that we do here at Yindyamarra Another Way. I want to also thank the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture for hosting us here in these beautiful grounds and for being able to continue to support the work that we do. This wasn't planned, but I think it is fitting given that we are here tonight under the cross, around this fire, the cross that symbolises the very thing that Scott was speaking. To find decency in our humiliation and in our suffering, to offer love and forgiveness even to those who inflict that suffering. As I say, it wasn't planned, but I would like to call my friend Jeff Broughton to the stage now, if he wouldn't mind, Father Jeff Broughton, to just, if he would, offer us a closing prayer as we pay thanks to Scott and to honour this night that we have met here to consider a better way of being able to live amongst one another. Thank you so much. Jeff, if you wouldn't mind.
So in whichever way you feel comfortable, let's adopt an attitude of prayer. It may be silence. I'll use words, but your heart may be silent. But as Stan has just said, as a person of faith and Christian faith, the most decent thing we ever gather on is at the foot of this cross, because there we experience the love that God shows us. So let me pray. God, I hesitate because our words, even our prayers, can be used as weapons, not as a balm. We know our own stories of using words to harm those we love, not to heal. But at the foot of the cross, we know we can find the love we need to be decent. Decent in the way that Scott has talked about. We thank you for his words, the way they have been a balm to our soul. And we pray that the words we now use with each other as we depart, the words we use and the silences we respect, may continue to be the balm that not only we need, but our world needs. And we thank you that in the cross of Christ, we have that balm. Amen.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Again, thank you so much for coming along tonight. It's a very special part of our year to be able to gather here for the Yindyamarra Oration. I hope you're all able to make it back here next year. For now, thank you for enduring the cold. Thank you for coming, and thank you for being able to pay attention to those important words we've heard from Scott tonight. There'll be some refreshments just over here to the side, and I hope to have see you all there and have a chat to you. And again, thanks for coming. I hope to see you next year. Thank you.